right, y'all. This is another episode of Stories, and this one's going to be The Call of the Wild by Jack London. It's fully illustrated and adapted. So, let's get into this, shall we? Alright. Give me a second here. I got to get to where I need to be here. I'm not prepared. I'm sorry about that. Let's go to... Here we are. Chapter 1. A Kidnapped King. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was ahead. Trouble, not just for him, but for every strong dog with warm, long hair along the western coastline. Men had found gold in the Arctic, and these men wanted dogs. The dogs they wanted were heavy dogs with strong muzzles to pull dog sleds and with furry coats to protect them from the frost. Buck lived at a big house in the sunny Santa Clara Valley. Judge Miller's place, it was called. It was a large, beautiful home with wraparound porches and a long driveway. The estate had wide lawns with great stables, grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then there was the big cement tank where Judge Miller's boys took their morning swim and kept cool in the hot afternoon. Buck ruled over this great estate. Here he was born, and here he had lived the 4 years of his life. There were other dogs, but they did not count. The house dogs and the kennel dogs came and went, but Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole place was his. He jumped into the swimming tank and went hunting with the judge's sons. He went with Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long walks. On wintry nights, he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring library fire. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back, or rolled them in the grass, and played with them in the orchards. Buck was king over all the other dogs and every person at the Miller estate. His father, Elmo, had been a huge St. Bernard, the judge's favorite. Buck was not so large. He weighed only 140 pounds, for his mother, Shep, had been a Scotch shepherd dog. Nevertheless, he carried himself like a much larger dog, like the king he was, with great pride. And this was the life Buck led in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike Gold dragged men from all over the world into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers. He did not know that men's hearts could be turned with greed. Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was such a man whose heart had turned, and his greedy eyes had fallen on Buck, a perfect sled dog. The judge was at a meeting, and the boys were at a club on the sad night of Manuel's crime. No one saw him take Buck and lead him through the orchard for an evening stroll. And only one man saw them arrive at the little train station known as College Park. This one man talked with Manuel and handed him money. "Are you going to tie him up?" the stranger asked gruffly. Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope around Buck's neck under the collar. "Twist it, and you'll choke him plenty," said Manuel. Buck did not resist the rope. He had learned to trust men he knew. But when the ends of the rope were placed in the stranger's hands, he growled to make the man let go. To his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath, which is sad as hell. That's not right. In a quick rage, he sprang at the man, but the man was ready. He threw Buck onto his back and tightened the rope more. Never in all his life had Buck been so cruelly treated, and never in all his life had he been so angry. But his strength left him. His eyes closed, and he fainted from the rope and the pain. He was not even aware when the train came and the two men threw him into the baggage car. The next he knew, he was being jolted along in something moving, and his tongue was hurting. The shriek of a train whistle told him where he was. He was kidnapped. He was a kidnapped king, now full of anger. He opened his eyes and saw a man in the baggage car. The man's hand sprang to pull the rope, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand, and he held on even as he was choked once again. Later, in a small saloon, the man complained of his night's ride. "All I get is $50 for this here dog," he grumbled, "and I wouldn't do it over for $1,000. He held Buck firmly by the rope. The man's hand was wrapped up, and his pants were ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other guy get?" the saloon keeper asked. "100 wouldn't take a penny less. That makes $150, the saloon keeper said, "and he's worth it, or I don't know dogs. Here, lend me a hand with this brass collar he's wearing." Dazed and in pain, Buck once more was thrown down and choked. The two men held him down as they filed his heavy brass collar from off his neck. Then the rope was removed, and he was flung into a cage-like crate. Without his collar, no one would ever know that he was the king of Judge Miller's estate. There he lay for the rest of the night. He could not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him in this narrow crate? Several times during the night he sprang to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge or the boys at least. But each time it was the ugly face of the saloon keeper that looked in on him, and each time his hope turned into a savage growl. In the morning, 4 men entered and picked up the crate. Evil-looking men. Buck stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him as the crate was lifted into a wagon. Then Buck began a long journey on a wagon, a truck, a ferry steamer, and finally on yet another train, passing through many hands to a place he knew not where. Chapter 2, The Law of Club. For 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. Shaking, he flung himself against the bars. The hunger was painful, but the thirst for water was torture. His throat was dry, his tongue was swollen, and his body burned with fever. He was glad for one thing. The rope was off his neck. Never again would a man get a rope around his neck. For in those days and nights of torment, he was changed into a new animal, a raging beast. He was so changed that the judge himself would not have recognized him. The train workers were glad to see this fierce beast leave the train at Seattle. 4 men carefully carried the crate from the wagon into a small yard. A stout man with a red sweater came out and signed the book for the driver. Buck knew this was the next tormentor, and he hurled himself against the bars. The man smiled grimly and brought out a hatchet and a club. You ain't going to take him out now? The driver asked. Sure, the man replied, prying the crate open with the hatchet. The 4 men who had carried the crate in quickly scattered and got atop a safe, high wall to watch. Buck snarled, growled, and rushed at the sides of the crate. Now, you red-eyed devil, said the man in the red sweater. When the crate was bashed open, he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. And Buck truly was a red-eyed devil, with hair bristling, mouth foaming, a mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes. Straight at the man he launched his 140 pounds of fury. In midair, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shocking blow. He whirled over, hitting the ground on his back inside. He had never been struck by a club in his life and did not understand. With a snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was again on his feet, and he launched into the air. And again, the shock came, and he was brought crushingly to the ground. This time he knew it was the club, but a dozen times he charged, and a dozen times the club broke the charge and smashed him down. Buck crawled to his feet, too dazed to rush. He staggered limply about, the blood flowing from nose and mouth and ears. Then the man gave him a frightful blow on the nose. All the pain he had ever known was nothing compared with this. With a lion-like roar, he again hurled himself at the man. The man struck a final blow, and Buck crumpled up and went down, knocked completely senseless. He can break a dog, that's what I say, one of the men on the wall exclaimed. I'd rather break wild mustangs any day, was the reply of the driver as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. The man read over the note that came with the crate. Well, Buck, my boy, he went on in a friendly voice, we've had our little lesson, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and all will go well. Be a bad dog, and I'll beat the stuffing out of you. Understand? As he spoke, he patted the head he had so cruelly pounded with no mercy. Buck's hair bristled at the touch of the hand, but he lay still. When the man brought him water, he drank eagerly, and later gulped down a meal of raw meat, chunk by chunk, from the man's hand. He was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. He saw that he stood no chance against a man with a club. He had learned the lesson, and he would never forget it. As the days went by, other dogs came in crates and at the ends of ropes. Some came quietly, and some raged and roared. Buck watched each new dog pass under the club of the man in the red sweater. And he knew then that a man with a club was a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed, but never a friend. More strangers came who talked quietly and eagerly to the man in the red sweater. Money passed between them and the strangers took one or more of the dogs away with them. Buck wondered where they went, for they never came back. And then his time came. A little wrinkled man who spoke broken English spotted Buck. Hola, he cried, when his eyes lit upon Buck. That one bully dog, eh? How much? 300, and that is a bargain, said the man in the red sweater. And you are paying with government money? You can afford that, eh, Perrault?" Perrault grinned. For so fine an animal, this was not a high price. The Canadian government could well afford such a dog. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew that he was 1 in 1,000. 1 in 10,000, he said to himself. Buck saw money pass between them. Perrault also bought another dog, a good-natured Newfoundland named Curly, and he led the two dogs away. That was the last Buck saw of the man in the red sweater. As Curly and he looked at the shoreline from the deck of the boat, it was the last he saw of the warm land of the Southland coast. Now we're on Chapter 3, The Law of Fang. Curly and Buck were taken below deck by Perrault and handed over to a large man called Francois. Both men were French-Canadian, tan and weathered from Klondike life. This was a new kind of man to Buck. He did not befriend them, but he grew to respect them. He soon learned that Perrault and Francois were fair men, but too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. Between decks, Buck and Curly joined two other dogs. One was a big snow-white fellow from Spitzbergen who had been brought away by a whaling captain. He was friendly, but not to be trusted. Spitz, as he was called, would smile while he planned some sneaky trick. And he indeed proved himself to be sneaky. When he stole from Buck's food at the first meal, Buck sprang to punish him. Just then the lash of Francois's whip sprang through the air, reaching the white dog first. Buck observed that this, at least, was fair treatment from this man with the whip. The other dog was called Dave. He was a quiet fellow who wanted to be left alone. His eyes told the others that there would be trouble if he were bothered. When the boat rolled and pitched, Buck and Curly became half wild with fear. But Dave merely raised his head as though annoyed, glanced their way, yawned, and went to sleep again. At last, one morning, the boat came to a stop. The excitement of change was in the air. Francois leashed the dogs and brought them on deck. At the first step upon the cold deck, Buck's feet sank into a white, mushy, something very like mud. He sprang back with a snort. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, but more of it fell upon him. He sniffed it curiously, then licked some up on his tongue. It bit like fire, and the next instant was gone. This puzzled him. He tried it again with the same results. The men laughed, and he felt ashamed. This was the first time he had ever seen snow. Buck's first day on the shore was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. No lazy, sunny life was this. Here there was no peace, no rest, nor a moment's safety, only confusion and danger. Buck knew he must stay alert. These dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them. They knew no law but the law of club and fang. He had never seen dogs fight as these wolfish dogs fought. Buck soon learned an awful lesson about life in these wild parts, and Curly, the Newfoundland, was the victim. They were camped near the log store where Curly, in her friendly way, walked up to a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf. With no warning, the husky leaped in like a flash, sank his teeth into Curly, then leaped back, almost in one motion. It was the wolf way of fighting, strike and leap away. Yet there was more to the wolf way than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the two dogs in a silent circle. Buck did not understand this silent circle, nor why there was licking their chops. Curly rushed the husky, who struck again and leaped aside. He met her next rush with his chest and tumbled her off her feet. She never got back up. This was what the circle of huskies had waited for. They closed in upon her, snarling and yelping in a mass attack. Within seconds, Curly was dead. Buck was shocked by this sudden, brutal act. He saw Spitz stick out his red tongue in a way he had of laughing. Then he saw Francois swinging an axe, spring into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them. It did not take long. The wild huskies were driven off, and there lay Curly, limp and lifeless in the snow. This memory often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So that was the way. No fair play? Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would see to it that he never went down. Spitz stuck out his tongue and laughed again. From that moment, Buck hated him with a bitter and deep hatred. Okay, y'all, we're on chapter 4, the team. Before long, Buck received another shock. Francois walked over to him with something made of leather straps. He then buckled and fastened this upon Buck. It was a harness. Buck had often seen such harnesses put on horses back home on Judge Miller's estate. These horses were then put to work, something Buck had never been made to do. Yet now he was set to work pulling Francois on a sled to the forest for a load of firewood. Buck had become a work animal. His pride suffered a blow. And though this was new and strange, he was determined to do his best. Buck became the middle member of the 3-dog sled team. He soon learned that order and teamwork were necessary. Francois was stern and taught the dogs to obey with his whip. Dave had worked on a team before and was an experienced wheeler, holding the position closest to the sled. He nipped at Buck's hind legs whenever he was in error. Spitz was the lead dog. He growled sharply now and again and threw his weight into the 2 straps, the traces that linked all the dogs. Buck learned easily and made good progress. Before they returned to camp, he knew enough to stop at Hoe, to give ahead at Mush, to swing wide on the bends, and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot downhill at their heels. 3 very good dogs, Francois told Perrault. That Buck, him can pull. I teach him quick as anything. By afternoon, Perrault returned with 2 more dogs. Billy and Joe, he called them. They were brothers and true huskies both, yet different as day and night. Billy was very friendly while Joe was sour and silent with an evil eye. Buck was friendly to both dogs, and Dave ignored them. Spitz wanted to prove who was leader from the start. When Billy wagged his tail at Spitz, the white dog attacked him, sinking sharp teeth into the husky's flank. Then Spitz circled Joe. Billy had fled, but Joe whirled around on his heels to face Spitz, ears laid back, lips snarling, jaws clipping together, and eyes gleaming with stubborn fear. By evening, Perrault brought another dog, an old thin husky with only one good eye. He was called Solex, which means angry one. Like Dave, he asked nothing, gave nothing, and commanded respect. Even Spitz left him alone. Solex did not like to be approached on his blind side. Buck was unlucky enough to discover this. Solek whirled upon Buck and slashed his shoulder to the bone when Buck walked up to the side with the bad eye. After this, Buck avoided his blind side and had no more trouble. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping out in the freezing cold. The tent was lit by a candle, and it glowed warmly. Buck walked into the warm tent, but both Perrault and Francois yelled and threw plates and cups at him till he fled into the outer cold. He lay down on the snow and attempted to sleep, but he was shivering. Sadly, he wandered about among the many tents. Each place was as cold as another. Finally, an idea came to him. He would return and see how his own teammates were making out. To his surprise, they had disappeared. Again, he wandered. He wandered about through the great camp, looking for them, and again he returned. Were they in the tent? No, that could not be. Else he would not have been driven out. Then where could they possibly be? With drooping tail and shivering body, he circled the tent. Suddenly the snow gave way beneath his forelegs, and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, but a friendly little yelp calmed him and brought him back. There, curled up under the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined, squirmed, and wriggled to show his goodwill, and even licked Buck's face with his warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, huh, eh? Buck selected a spot, and after a few tries finally dug a hole for himself. The day had been long and hard. He slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Buck did not open his eyes until he heard the sounds of the waking camp. At first, he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The muscles of his whole body ached. The hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end. With a ferocious snarl, he bounded straight up into the open air, sending the snow flying. He landed on his feet and saw the camp. Then he remembered everything that had happened to him, from the stroll with Manuel, to the boat ride, to the sled team, to the hole he had dug for himself the night before. "What I say," the dog driver Francois cried to Perrault. "Dat Buck for sure learn quick as anything." Perrault nodded. The Canadian government needed the best dogs on this run. He was glad to have Buck. 3 more Huskies were added to the team, making a total of 9. Before long, they were in harness and swinging up the trail away from the camp. Buck was glad to be gone. The work was hard, but he did not hate it. He was surprised at how much the other dogs enjoyed the work. They were all eager to get down the trail. Dave was wheeler, or sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Solek. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file to the leader, Spitz. Buck had been placed between Dave and Solek to be taught the way of the team. When he needed instruction, he received a sharp nip or a pull in the traces. That day, they made 40 miles on the snow-packed trail. The next few days, they had to blaze a new trail, which was harder work and took more time. Perrault traveled ahead of the team, packing the snow with webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francois usually guided the sled with the gee pole. Perrault was in a hurry, but he knew the danger in rushing onto a thin autumn ice. Day after day, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark of the early hours. At the first gray of dawn, they were hitting the trail. After dark, the men pitched camp. The dogs ate their bit of fish and crawled to sleep into the snow. Buck was starving. His pound and a half of sun-dried salmon was not enough food for his aching belly. The other dogs weighed less and were born to this life. A pound only of the fish kept them in good condition. Buck watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, slyly steal a slice of bacon when Perrault's back was turned, he copied the trick the following day, getting away with the whole chunk. An uproar was raised, but Buck was not suspected. Dub, who was always getting caught, was blamed and punished for Buck's misdeed. Buck quickly grew strong and wise. His muscles became as hard as iron, and he grew used to pain. He could eat anything, no matter how disgusting. He learned to bite the ice out with his teeth when it collected between his toes. When he was thirsty and the ice was thick over a water hole, he would strike and break it with stiff forelegs. His sense of smell and sense of hearing became very keen. His instincts came alive within him. The instincts of the wild. The instincts of his nature. On the quiet, cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like. The old song of his ancient ancestors ran through him, and he began to discover the primitive beast within him. A buck he never knew. A buck that he come alive, all because men had found gold in the north, and because Manuel was a greedy man. All right, y'all, we're on Chapter 5, The Primitive Beast. The primitive beast was strong in Buck, and his life on the trail made it more and more dominant. He became cunning, with great poise and intelligence. He did not pick fights, and he avoided them whenever possible. Even though he hated Spitz, he remained in control of his actions. On the other hand, Spitz was always showing his teeth. He bullied Buck, trying to start the fight that could end only in the death of one or the other. At the end of one hard day, they set up a quick camp on the shore of Lake Labarge. The wind cut like a white-hot knife. Darkness and the driving snow forced them to search for a camping place. Under a sheltering rock, Buck made his nest in the snow. It was so snug and warm that he hated to leave it when Francois brought out a dinner of thawed fish. But when Buck finished his meal and returned, he found his nest occupied. There came a snarl from the trespasser. It was Spitz. Till now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared. He sprang upon Spitz with a fury that surprised them both. Francois was surprised too, when both men rushed out to see the cause of the trouble. "Ah!" he cried to cheer on Buck. "Give it to him! Give it to him! The dirty thief!" Spitz and Buck were circling each other with rage and caution. Then suddenly, something happened that stopped the fight. Perrault cried out, and Buck heard the sound of a club and a shrill yelp of pain. The camp was alive with strange furry forms, a pack of starving huskies. There were 80 to 100 of them. They had smelled the camp from some Indian village and were crazed by the smell of food. In an instant, the skinny brutes scrambled for the bread and bacon in a grub box. The men used their clubs with no effect. The wild dogs yelped and howled under the blows, but struggled madly till the last crumb was devoured. The sled dogs burst out of their nests, only to be attacked by the fierce wild huskies. Never had Buck seen such dogs. They were like skeletons with blazing eyes and frothing fangs, leaping toward the sled dogs. Buck's head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Selects dripped with blood, fighting bravely side by side. Joe snapped fiercely upon an invader's leg. Pike finished the job. Buck flung himself upon one, then another, till he felt teeth sink into his own throat. It was Spitz attacking him from the side. Perrault and Francois hurried to save their sled dogs. The wild, starving beasts fled, and Buck shook himself free of Spitz. But it was only for a moment. The men then ran back to save the rest of the grub, and the Huskies returned to attack the team. Billy sprang through the savage circle and fled away over the ice. Pike and Dub followed on his heels, with the rest of the team behind. As Buck drew himself together to spring after them, out of the corner of his eye he saw Spitz rush upon him. He took the brunt of Spitz's charge, then joined the flight out on the frozen lake. Later, the 9 team dogs gathered together in the forest. There was not one who was not wounded in 4 or 5 places. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team, had a badly torn throat. Joe had lost an eye. The good-natured Billy, with a ripped ear, cried and whimpered throughout the night. At daybreak, they limped back to camp. The wild huskies had fled, and the 2 men were in bad moods. Half their grub supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through the sled lashings. They had eaten a pair of Perrault's moose hide moccasins, chunks out of the leather traces, and even 2 feet of lash from the end of Francois's whip. He looked up from the mess to see to his wounded dogs, wounded with the bites of huskies gone mad. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, "maybe it make you mad dog, those many bites. Maybe all mad dog. What you think, eh, Perrault?" Perrault shook his head. With 400 miles of trail still between him and Dawson, he could not afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours and much hard work later, the harnesses were repaired and the wounded team was underway. The hardest part of the trail between them and Dawson lay before them. All right, y'all, we're on Chapter 6, The Fight. It took 6 days of toil to cover 30 terrible miles. A dozen times Perrault, nosing the way, broke through the ice, being saved by the long pole he carried. Each time he broke through, he had to quickly build a fire to dry his garments. Once the sled broke through, pulling Dave and Buck with it, they were half frozen and all but drowned by the time they were dragged out. At another time, Spitz went through, dragging the whole team after him up to Buck, who strained backward with all his strength. Behind him was Dave, straining backward, and behind the sled was Francois, pulling till his tendons cracked. All right. The entire team became exhausted. Perrault, to make up lost time, still pushed the tired dogs late and early. Buck's feet were not so compact and hard as the feet of the huskies. All day long he limped in pain. At camp, he lay down like a dead dog. He could not even move to get his dinner. Francois had to bring it to him. Perrault rubbed Buck's feet for half an hour each night after supper. He cut off the tops of his own moccasins to make 4 moccasins for Buck. This was a great relief. One morning, Francois forgot the moccasins, and Buck lay on his back, his 4 feet waving in the air. Perrault grinned at the sight of a dog that refused to budge without his shoes. Later, Buck's feet grew hard to the trail, and the worn-out footgear was thrown away. One morning, as they were harnessing up, Dolly went suddenly mad. Her long, sad wolf howl sent every dog bristling with fear. She then sprang straight for Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad, and he fled in panic. Dolly, foaming at the mouth, ran wildly after Buck. At Francois's call, Buck circled back into camp. Here the dog driver waited with the axe, which he brought down on the crazed sick dolly. Buck staggered over to the sled, exhausted, sobbing for breath. This was Spitz's opportunity. He sprang upon Buck, and twice his teeth sank in and ripped the flesh to the bone. Then Francois's lash cracked, and Buck watched Spitz receive the worst whipping as yet given to any of the team. "One devil, dat Spitz," remarked Perrault. "Some day him kill dat Buck. Dat Buck is two devils," was Francois's reply. "All de time I watch dat Buck, I know for sure. Listen, some fine day, him get angry, and den him chew dat Spitz all up. Sure I know." From then on, it was war between Buck and Spitz. Spitz, as lead dog, had battled many dogs before, but Buck was different. He was smarter and more patient. Buck wanted the leadership position. He wanted it because it was his nature. He wanted it because he was gripped with a pride that matched the pride of Spitz. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, Pike did not appear. He was hidden in his nest under a foot of snow. Francois called for him, but he still did not come. Spitz was wild with anger that a dog would disobey. He raged through the camp, smelling and digging until he found Pike in his hiding place. Spitz flew at Pike to punish him. Just then, Buck flew with equal rage in between. Surprised, Spitz hurled backward and off his feet. Pike joined the fight, and Buck also sprang upon Spitz. But Francois chuckled at the fight, brought his lash down upon Buck with all his might. Half stunned, Buck was knocked backward, and the lash fell upon him again and again, while Spitz soundly punished Pike. In the days that followed, as Dawson grew closer and closer, Buck continued to interfere between Spitz and the other dogs. But he was crafty, waiting until Francois was not around. The team went from bad to worse. Things no longer went right. There was a constant nipping and yelping, and at the bottom of it all was Buck. He kept Francois busy, watching out for the life and death struggle between Spitz and Buck that he knew would take place sooner or later. They pulled into Dawson one dreary afternoon, with the great fight still to come. Here were many men and countless dogs, all at work. All day they swung up and down the main street in long teams, and in the night their jingling bells still went by. Here and there Buck met Southland dogs like himself, but most were the wild wolf husky breed. Every night, regularly at 9, at 12, and 3, they howled the eerie old song. Buck joined them, the new Buck, the primordial beast. The team rested for a day, then got back on the trail. They made splendid progress, but Buck kept stirring up trouble along the way. They no longer worked as one dog in the traces. Spitz was no longer a leader who was feared or respected. Pike robbed him of half a fish one night and gulped it down under the protection of Buck. Another night, Dub and Joe fought Spitz and watched him take the punishment that they deserved. And even Billy, the good-natured, grew more brave. Buck never came near Spitz without snarling and bristling. Francois became furious with the team. His lash was always singing among the dogs, but it did little good. When his back was turned, the dogs were at it again. Francois knew Buck was behind all of the trouble, and Buck knew Francois knew Buck was too clever to ever again be caught red-handed. One night after supper, Dub turned up a snowshoe rabbit, and in a second the whole team was in a full cry. 100 yards away was a camp of the Northwest Police, with 50 huskies who joined the rabbit chase. The rabbits sped down the river and turned off into a small creek. Up the frozen bed, Buck led the pack 60 strong, around bend after bend, but he could not gain. His splendid body flashed forward, leap by leap, in the pale white moonlight. And leap by leap, the snowshoe rabbit flashed on ahead. Buck still led the pack, running the wild thing down. But Spitz, cold and crafty, left the pack and cut across a piece of land along the creek. Buck did not know this. As Buck rounded the bend, he saw a large frosty shadow leap into the path of the rabbit. It was Spitz. The rabbit could not turn, and Spitz's white teeth seized it. Buck made no sound, but drove in upon Spitz, shoulder to shoulder, so hard that he missed the throat. They rolled over and over in the powdery snow. Spitz gained his feet almost as though he had not been overthrown, slashing Buck's shoulder and leaping clear. In a flash, Buck knew it. The time had come. It was to the death. As they circled about, snarling, ears laid back, Buck's instincts took over. He seemed to remember it all. The white woods and earth and moonlight and the thrill of battle. The air was silent and the wolf huskies circled, their eyes gleaming. Spitz knew how to fight, and whenever Buck lunged, he was met with quicker fangs. Time and time again he leaped at Spitz, and each time Spitz slashed him and got away. Spitz was untouched, while Buck was streaming with blood and panting hard. The fight was growing desperate. Once Buck flipped over, and the whole circle of 60 dogs started up, but he recovered himself, almost in midair, and the circle sank down again and waited. Buck was smart, smarter than any dog Spitz had known. He rushed, pretending to go for the shoulder, but at the last instant he swept in low and closed on Spitz's left foreleg. The bone broke, and the white dog faced him on 3 legs. Buck tried again to knock him over, and then swept in to break the right foreleg. Despite the pain and helplessness, Spitz struggled to keep up. But there was no hope for Spitz, and no mercy. Buck readied for the final rush. A pause seemed to fall. Every animal stood still, as though turned to stone. Then Buck sprang in, delivered the final bite, and sprang out. No more would Spitz stand in his way. Buck was again king. We're on chapter 7, y'all. Who will lead? Eh? What I say? I speak true when I say that. Buck 2 devils, said Francois the next morning. Dat Spitz fight like the devil, said Perrault, as he looked over the rips and cuts. And that Buck fight like 2 devils, was Francois's answer. And now we make good time. No more Spitz, no more trouble, sure. Perrault packed up and loaded the sled while Francois started to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up to the place Spitz used to hold as a leader. Francois, not noticing him, brought Sol-leks to the lead. Buck sprang upon Sol-leks in a fury, driving him back and standing in his place. Eh, Francois cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. Look at dat Buck. Him kill dat Spitz. Him think to take de job. Go away, Buck. Go away now, Buck. Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, dragged him to one side, and put Sol-leks back in the lead. The old dog did not like it. He was afraid of Buck. When Francois turned his back, Buck again made Sol-leks step aside. Francois was angry. Now by darn I fix you, he cried, coming back with a heavy club in his hand. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater, and backed away slowly. He did not charge in when Sol-leks was once more put in the lead. He circled just beyond reach of the club, snarling with rage. The driver went about his work. He called to Buck when he was ready to put him in his old place in front of Dave. Buck took 2 or 3 steps back. Francois followed him. Buck retreated again. After some time of this, Francois threw down the club, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing. But Buck was in open revolt. He wanted to be the leader. It was his right. It was by right. He had earned it, and he would not be content with less. Perrault came to help, but for an hour the 2 men could not get Buck into position. They threw clubs at him. He dodged. They yelled at him, and he snarled and kept out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but retreated around and around the camp. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault angrily looked at his watch. Time was flying. They should have been on the trail an hour ago. Francois scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned at Perrault, who shrugged his shoulders. When Francois went up to where Sol-leks stood and called to Buck, Buck laughed as dogs laugh, yet kept his distance. Francois unfastened Sol-leks' traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed and ready for the trail, with only one open spot, the lead position. Francois called, and Buck trotted in, laughing in triumph. He swung around into position at the head of the team. His traces were fastened. The sled was broken out, and with both men running, they dashed out onto the river trail. Buck proved to be an excellent leader. He kept order among the dogs and kept the team moving at a fast pace. Dave and Sol-leks did not mind the change in leadership. They loved the work, the toil in the traces, and Buck worked them hard. The rest of the team had grown unruly during Spitz's last days, and they were surprised at how Buck got them all into shape. Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels, was used to being lazy. Buck swiftly punished him, and before the first day was done, Pike was pulling more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe, the sour one, was disciplined with bites and snarls. Buck let the team know who was boss, and the team improved greatly. Once more, the dogs leaped as one dog in the traces. At the rink rapids, 2 native huskies, Teak and Kuna, were added. Buck broke them so quickly it took away Francois' breath. "Never such a dog as dat, Buck," he cried. "No, never. Him worth $1,000 for sure, eh? What you say, Perrault?" And Perrault nodded. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard. There was no new soft snow, and it was not too cold. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on the jump. On the last night of the second week, they topped White Pass and dropped down the sea slope toward Skagway. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days, they had averaged 40 miles. When they reached Skagway, the team became the center of attention by a crowd of dogbusters and mushers. The mission was now complete. The 2 Canadians had new orders that required a fresh team of dogs. Francois called Buck to him, threw his arms around him, and wept goodbye. And that was the last of Francois and Perrault. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good.